Hello everyone, if you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The day we left everything behind. Some people believe the hardest part of changing your life is packing the boxes. I used to believe that too, until one quiet morning in America, I stood in my kitchen holding a coffee cup that suddenly felt heavier than my future. Have you ever smiled at everyone while secretly wondering if your entire life is moving in the wrong direction? If you've ever felt trapped, exhausted, or afraid to begin again, stay with me. This story may sound simple at first, but one unexpected moment changed the way I looked at love, family, and even learning English forever. The ending of this chapter is probably not what you're expecting. My name is Emily, and this is the story of the day my family decided to leave everything familiar behind without leaving the United States. We weren't escaping a disaster. No one lost a job. No one was running away. From the outside, our life looked comfortable. We lived in a peaceful neighborhood, our children laughed in the backyard every weekend. And my husband and I followed the same routine that had quietly shaped our lives for years. But routines can become invisible walls. Every morning felt exactly like the one before. I woke up, made breakfast, drove the kids to school, answered emails, cleaned the house, prepared dinner, watched television for an hour, and went to bed already knowing what tomorrow would look like. Nothing was wrong. Yet something inside me felt strangely empty. One evening my daughter looked at me and asked, "Mom, when was the last time we tried something that scared us?" I laughed because children ask impossible questions without realizing it. But later that night, her words refused to leave my mind. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I had done anything that made my heart race in a good way. Around that time I had started a small daily habit. Every evening I read a short English story out loud for 15 minutes. My English was already good enough for everyday life, but reading slowly helped me relax. I noticed something surprising. The stories weren't just improving my pronunciation. They were changing my thinking. Every simple sentence reminded me that progress doesn't arrive all at once. It grows quietly, one page at a time, just like confidence. Scientists often explain that our brains naturally prefer familiar routines because they require less energy. It's called the brain's efficiency bias. Familiar choices feel safe, even when they slowly make us unhappy. The more I learned about that idea, the more I wondered if our family wasn't actually comfortable. Maybe we were simply predictable. One Saturday afternoon my husband spread a large map of the United States across the dining table. It wasn't for vacation planning. It wasn't for work. He simply pointed west and asked, if we could start fresh somewhere else, where would you choose? At first we treated it like a game. The kids circled mountains, lakes, and national parks with colorful markers. We laughed about snowy winters, sunny beaches, tiny towns, and busy cities. But then the room became unusually quiet. Nobody folded the map. Nobody changed the subject. For the first time, the impossible question no longer felt impossible. During the next few weeks we talked about weather, schools, neighborhoods, healthcare, local culture, outdoor life, and what kind of future we truly wanted instead of the future we had accidentally created. Friends thought we were joking. Why would anyone leave a perfectly stable life? That question followed me everywhere. At the grocery store. During neighborhood walks. Even while practicing English with my favorite audiobook. I didn't always know the answer, but I could feel one growing inside me. Sometimes life doesn't ask whether you're comfortable. It asks whether you're still growing. Then something happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning that forced our decision far sooner than any of us expected. A single phone call arrived while I was pouring cereal for the kids, and after I answered it, I looked at my husband without saying a single word. His face changed immediately because somehow he already knew everything had just changed. What I heard during that call would decide where our family would be living only a few weeks later. The phone call that changed our route. Have you ever answered a phone call that lasted less than 2 minutes but quietly divided your life into 2 chapters, before and after? I still remember the sound of my children laughing in the kitchen while I stood frozen with my phone in my hand, realizing that every plan I thought was certain had suddenly become a question. I believed moving across America would simply mean changing an address. I was wrong. Before the first moving box was taped shut, our hearts had already begun the longest journey of all. I looked at my husband, and without saying a word, I handed him the phone. He listened carefully, thanked the caller, and placed the phone on the kitchen counter. For several seconds neither of us spoke. The silence felt louder than any conversation we had ever shared. Finally, he smiled a little and asked, "What do you think?" I laughed because I honestly didn't know what to think. We had just received an unexpected opportunity to transfer to another office several states away. It wasn't a promotion that would instantly change our financial future. It wasn't an emergency either. It was simply a chance to begin somewhere completely different. Strange how ordinary words can carry extraordinary consequences. That evening we sat together after the children had gone to bed. Outside, the neighborhood looked exactly the same as always. Streetlights glowed softly. Someone walked a dog across the sidewalk. A neighbor watered flowers. Everything looked peaceful, yet inside our home every familiar thing suddenly felt temporary. We started making lists. The advantages filled one page. The fears filled another. Surprisingly, the second page became much longer. What if the children hated their new school? What if we missed our friends? What if we regretted leaving? And perhaps the question I never admitted aloud was even scarier. What if nothing actually became better? Psychologists often explain that uncertainty activates the brain's threat system. Our minds naturally imagine worst-case scenarios long before they imagine success. Understanding that fact didn't remove my fear, but it helped me recognize it. Fear wasn't proof that we were making the wrong decision. Sometimes fear simply appears because something important is changing. During those uncertain days, I kept reading simple English stories every evening. Slowly reading each sentence forced my breathing to slow down as well. I even noticed myself borrowing useful expressions from the stories during everyday conversations. Small habits have surprising power. They don't erase anxiety, but they keep anxiety from becoming your entire identity. Our children reacted very differently. My son immediately searched for hiking trails, basketball courts, and local baseball teams in the new area. My daughter searched for libraries, bookstores, and cafes. Their excitement reminded me of something adults often forget. Children usually see possibility before they see inconvenience. I wondered when I had stopped doing the same. Over the following week we drove through neighborhoods, visited parks, compared weather reports, studied school ratings, and watched dozens of videos about different communities across America. Every town seemed to whisper a different future. One promised quiet mornings. Another promised exciting opportunities. Another promised beautiful mountains. Choosing a place began to feel less like shopping for a house and more like choosing the next version of ourselves. Friends continued asking the same question. Why leave when your life already works? I finally found an answer. Because working isn't always the same as living. Even saying those words surprised me. They sounded true before I fully understood why. Then, just as we were ready to accept the transfer, an email arrived late one Friday night. At first glance it looked completely ordinary. But hidden inside one short paragraph was a detail no one had mentioned before, a detail that could completely change where we would live. Whether our children could stay together, and whether accepting this opportunity was even possible anymore. I stared at the screen, my heartbeat growing faster with every line I read, knowing tomorrow's conversation could change everything again. A house that didn't feel like home. The strangest part about starting over isn't sleeping in a different house. It's waking up one morning and realizing that everything around you is new. Yet the biggest mystery is whether you are becoming a new version of yourself. I thought unpacking boxes would be the hardest challenge. Instead, it was opening the front door every morning and wondering if this unfamiliar place would ever feel like home. What happened during our first week surprised me more than the move itself, and one unexpected knock on our door changed everything again. We accepted the transfer after discovering that the confusing email was simply describing a flexible work arrangement, not a permanent restriction. The relief washed over our family like sunshine after days of heavy rain. Within a few weeks, we packed our furniture, loaded the moving truck, and drove across several states toward our new community. When we finally arrived, the house looked exactly like the online photos, but somehow much quieter. Every empty room echoed with possibility. I stood in the living room surrounded by unopened boxes while my children raced upstairs, already arguing about who would get which bedroom. Their laughter filled the house before our furniture ever did. I smiled, but deep inside I felt something unexpected. Excitement and loneliness can exist at the same time. The first few mornings felt strangely unfamiliar. I reached for coffee cups that were packed inside unknown boxes. I drove to the grocery store using GPS even though it was only a few minutes away. I waved politely at neighbors whose names I couldn't remember. Everything was ordinary, yet every ordinary task required extra attention. Psychologists often explain that our brains build comfort through repetition. Familiar streets, favorite stores, and daily routines quietly reduce mental effort. When those patterns disappear, the brain works harder, which is one reason moving can feel emotionally exhausting even when nothing bad has happened. Understanding that made me kinder to myself. I wasn't failing to adjust. My brain was simply learning a new map. Every evening I continued reading one short English story aloud. It became the one familiar habit that traveled with me. Sometimes I practiced new expressions before speaking with neighbors or cashiers. One afternoon I used the phrase, "We're still getting settled," and the cashier smiled warmly before recommending her favorite local bakery. It was such a small conversation, yet it reminded me that confidence often grows through tiny moments instead of dramatic breakthroughs. Our children adapted much faster than I expected. By the third day they were already exploring nearby parks and talking excitedly about meeting classmates. Watching them made me realize adults often overestimate the risks of change while children naturally search for opportunities. My husband also seemed calmer than I was. One evening he gently reminded me that a house doesn't become a home because of its walls. It becomes home because of the memories created inside it. I carried those words with me during every walk through our new neighborhood. Slowly, familiar faces began appearing. The woman who walked her golden retriever every morning smiled every time we crossed paths. The elderly man watering flowers always waved before sunrise. Even the local coffee shop barista remembered my order after only 3 visits. Tiny connections started replacing uncertainty. Then came Saturday morning. I decided to leave my phone at home and explore the neighborhood on foot. The air was fresh, children rode bicycles through quiet streets, and colorful gardens stretched across nearly every front yard. Everything seemed peaceful until I noticed one house that looked completely different from every other home on the block. The curtains remained closed, the mailbox overflowed, and a single moving truck sat silently in the driveway with no one unloading it. Just as I slowed down to look, the front door opened a few inches, and someone quietly called my name. I froze immediately because I had never met anyone living there, and somehow, impossibly, they already knew exactly who I was. The neighbor who already knew my name. What would you do if a complete stranger opened the door, looked directly at you, and softly said your name before you had ever introduced yourself? For one strange second, I wondered if I had forgotten meeting someone. Then another thought crossed my mind. Had my family unknowingly stepped into a story much bigger than a simple move across America? I walked toward the house with equal parts curiosity and caution. Completely unaware that this unexpected conversation would teach me one of the most important lessons about trust, community, and even learning English. The woman standing behind the half-open door smiled as if she had been expecting me all morning. She looked about my age, wearing gardening gloves and a faded baseball cap. Before I could ask how she knew me, she laughed gently and pointed across the street. "Your husband introduced your family to almost everyone while you were unpacking," she said. "He said you enjoy morning walks, so I guessed I'd meet you sooner or later." I couldn't help laughing at myself. My imagination had traveled much farther than reality. She introduced herself as Rachel. And within minutes we were sitting on her front porch drinking iced tea while the summer breeze moved quietly through the trees. Sometimes the biggest mysteries have the simplest answers. Rachel had lived in the neighborhood for almost 15 years. She seemed to know every family, every dog, every shortcut, and even which grocery store baked the freshest bread on Wednesday mornings. She explained that neighbors here often looked after one another. If someone traveled, another family collected their mail. If a storm arrived, everyone checked on older residents. It wasn't written anywhere. It was simply part of the local culture. Listening to her reminded me that every community has invisible traditions you only discover by living there. During our conversation, I occasionally searched for simple English words before speaking. Rachel noticed but never interrupted. Instead, she naturally repeated certain expressions in her replies, giving me another chance to hear them clearly. Without realizing it, I was practicing English through genuine conversation instead of formal lessons. Research in language learning often shows that meaningful communication helps vocabulary stay in long-term memory much more effectively than memorizing isolated word lists. That afternoon proved exactly why. I remembered every phrase because each one belonged to a real moment. Over the next several days, Rachel introduced me to local farmers markets, walking trails, and a small independent bookstore that quickly became one of my favorite places. The bookstore hosted weekly reading circles where people read short stories aloud at a relaxed pace. I hesitated before attending the first meeting, worried I might stumble over a few words. Rachel smiled and said something I still remember today. People don't connect because someone speaks perfectly. They connect because someone speaks honestly. Those words stayed with me long after the meeting ended. Surprisingly, reading slowly in front of others wasn't frightening at all. Everyone encouraged each other, laughed at small mistakes, and celebrated small improvements. I realized confidence isn't built by waiting until you're perfect. It's built by showing up before you feel ready. Meanwhile, our children settled happily into their new routines. They returned from school every afternoon with stories about new friends, different teachers, and exciting activities. Watching them adapt reminded me that curiosity is stronger than fear when we allow it to be. Even my husband admitted he felt lighter than he had in years. Our evenings slowly filled with neighborhood walks instead of television. We laughed more often. We talked longer during dinner. Somehow, changing our address had quietly changed our habits as well. Then one evening Rachel knocked on our front door carrying an old photo album. "I found something while cleaning my attic," she said with an unusual expression. She carefully opened one page and pointed toward a faded photograph taken decades earlier. My smile disappeared instantly. Standing near the center of the picture was someone whose face looked unbelievably familiar, someone connected to my own family history in a way that should have been impossible. Rachel looked at me and whispered, "I think we need to talk." Love was tested in silence. Have you ever discovered that the biggest challenge in a marriage isn't a loud argument, but the quiet moments when both people pretend everything is fine? I thought moving across America would bring our family closer overnight. Instead, the stress arrived in small, invisible pieces that almost nobody noticed. Then an old photograph, one unexpected conversation, and a single sentence from my husband forced me to ask a question I had been avoiding for months. Were we building a new life together, or slowly growing apart without realizing it? Rachel placed the faded photograph on my kitchen table. The image had been taken decades earlier during a neighborhood community event. Most of the faces meant nothing to me until my eyes stopped on one woman standing near the middle. She looked remarkably like my grandmother when she was young. My heart skipped for a moment. Rachel quickly explained that it wasn't actually my grandmother. It was a former resident who simply shared an incredible resemblance. We both laughed with relief, but the conversation unexpectedly turned toward family history, relationships, and how every generation carries its own dreams and disappointments. That evening, after Rachel left, I noticed something I had ignored for weeks. My husband looked exhausted. He smiled whenever the children were around, but the moment they walked upstairs, the smile quietly disappeared. We had spent so much energy organizing furniture, learning new streets, helping the kids settle into school, and adjusting to different routines that we had forgotten to check on each other. One night we sat on the back porch after sunset. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, he looked at me and said, "I know everyone thinks this move has been exciting, but sometimes I wonder if I've asked too much from you." His words surprised me because I had been carrying the exact same thought about him. Psychology researchers often describe something called emotional load sharing. In healthy relationships, partners don't eliminate each other's stress. They reduce its weight simply by acknowledging it together. That conversation became one of the most important moments of our marriage. We didn't solve every problem that night. We simply stopped pretending that we had none. From then on, we created one small habit. Every evening after dinner, we took a 20-minute walk through our neighborhood without our phones. Sometimes we talked about work. Sometimes about the children. Sometimes we simply enjoyed the silence. Those walks slowly became more valuable than expensive vacations because they reminded us that connection grows through consistency. not grand gestures. During those walks, I also practiced speaking simple English naturally. Instead of memorizing difficult vocabulary, I described what I saw around me. The sky looks peaceful today. These trees remind me of autumn. That house has beautiful flowers. My husband gently corrected small mistakes only when I asked. Learning English became part of our conversations rather than another task on my schedule. I noticed something wonderful. The more relaxed I felt emotionally, the more confidently I spoke. Language and emotions are deeply connected. Confidence often improves fluency more than perfect grammar does. Our children began noticing the difference too. Family dinners became longer. Laughter returned more often. We started exploring local parks every weekend, discovering hidden lakes, scenic trails, and small family-owned restaurants that made our new town feel increasingly familiar. For the first time since moving, I stopped comparing everything to our old neighborhood. I had quietly begun belonging here. Then came Friday afternoon. My husband called unexpectedly and asked if we could meet at a small cafe near his office instead of going straight home. His voice sounded calm, but unusually serious. When I arrived, he was already sitting by the window with 2 cups of coffee. Beside him lay a sealed envelope that I had never seen before. He looked into my eyes, gently pushed the envelope across the table, and said, "Before you open this, I need you to promise you'll let me explain everything." My hands froze above the envelope as dozens of possibilities rushed through my mind. And I suddenly realized this ordinary afternoon might become the turning point of our entire future. The envelope I was afraid to open. Some moments change your life before you even know what's inside them. As I stared at the sealed envelope on the cafe table, I imagined 100 different endings. Was it bad news? A job offer? Another move? Or something my husband had been hiding because he didn't know how to tell me? My heartbeat grew louder than the conversations around us, and for the first time since we moved across America, I realized that the greatest surprises don't always arrive with noise. Sometimes they arrive quietly, inside an ordinary white envelope on an ordinary Friday afternoon. I looked at my husband, searching his face for clues, but all I saw was nervous hope. "Please," he said softly, "read it all before you decide how you feel." I took a slow breath and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter from his company. I expected another transfer notice or a change in responsibilities. Instead, I found something completely different. The company was offering him a new leadership position, but there was one condition. The role would require occasional travel during the first year. My eyes stopped on that sentence. I immediately thought about our children, our new routines, and everything we had just worked so hard to build. Before I could speak, he reached across the table and gently held my hand. "I haven't accepted anything," he said. "I wanted us to decide together." That single sentence meant more to me than the promotion itself. It reminded me that marriage isn't about making perfect decisions. It's about making important decisions side by side. Relationship experts often explain that couples who feel included in major life choices tend to build stronger long-term trust. Looking back, I understand why. Being asked for your opinion is another way of being told that your voice matters. We spent nearly 2 hours talking in that little cafe. We discussed schedules, family dinners, school events, weekend trips, and even the possibility of saying no if the promotion demanded too much from our family. Surprisingly, neither of us focused on money. We focused on time. Time together had become more valuable than anything we could earn. When we finally left the cafe, we still hadn't made a final decision, but something had changed. We weren't carrying the question alone anymore. That evening our children greeted us at the front door with exciting stories from school. My daughter had joined a reading club, while my son proudly showed us a science project he had started with new classmates. Watching their excitement reminded me that children often measure happiness differently than adults. They care less about titles and salaries and more about whether their parents are present enough to celebrate small victories. Later that night, I continued my daily English reading practice. The story included one simple sentence that stayed with me long after I closed the book. Home is not the place where nothing changes. Home is the place where love stays. I read the sentence aloud several times because it felt strangely connected to my own life. Practicing English had quietly become more than language learning. Every story gave me new words, but it also gave me new ways to understand my own experiences. I noticed my pronunciation becoming smoother, but more importantly, I noticed my confidence growing. I no longer worried about sounding perfect. I wanted to sound genuine. The next morning, our family spent the day exploring a nearby state park. We walked through tall pine trees, watched children skipping stones across a quiet lake, and shared sandwiches on a wooden picnic table. It felt wonderfully ordinary, and maybe that was the greatest gift of all. Ordinary days had started feeling special again. As the sun began to set, my husband's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, frowned slightly, and stepped away to answer the call. He spoke for only a minute before returning much more quietly than before. I asked if everything was okay. He nodded, but the hesitation in his eyes told a different story. Then he looked at me and said, "I think we need to visit someone tomorrow. There's something about this town, something I never told you because I didn't think it mattered anymore." At that moment, I realized our move across America was connected to a story that had begun years before we ever arrived. And whatever waited for us tomorrow could change the way I understood my husband forever. The secret my husband kept for years. What if the person you trust most tells you they have one last secret, not because they wanted to hide it, but because they believed it no longer mattered? I barely slept that night. Every possibility raced through my mind. Was it a forgotten promise? An old friendship? A painful memory connected to this town? By sunrise, I realized something surprising. Sometimes the stories we fear hearing become the very stories that help us understand the people we love most. I quietly made coffee while the house remained still. My husband came into the kitchen looking thoughtful, almost as if he had been rehearsing difficult words all night. We didn't wake the children early. Instead, Rachel offered to watch them for a few hours, insisting that some conversations deserved uninterrupted time. As we drove through quiet American streets, I noticed autumn leaves beginning to gather along the sidewalks. The town looked peaceful, yet inside the car every mile felt heavier than the last. Finally, my husband broke the silence. "Before I met you," he said gently, "I lived here for less than a year." I turned toward him, surprised. He had mentioned working in different states years ago, but never this town. "It wasn't an important chapter," he continued. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. We stopped outside a small public library surrounded by tall maple trees. It wasn't an office building or an old family home as I had imagined. It was simply a library. He smiled faintly when he noticed my confused expression. "This place changed my life once," he said. We walked inside. The familiar scent of books filled the quiet rooms. Sunlight streamed through large windows where people sat reading without speaking. My husband pointed toward a corner near the history shelves. I used to come here almost every evening after work, he explained. Back then I felt completely lost. I wasn't unhappy because life was terrible. I was unhappy because I had stopped believing I could become someone better. His honesty caught me off guard. During all our years together, I had always seen him as calm and confident. Hearing that he had once struggled with doubt made him feel even more real. He smiled as he remembered borrowing books about communication, relationships, and personal growth. One librarian even encouraged him to read simple English stories aloud to improve confidence when speaking in public. I laughed because without realizing it, we had both discovered the same habit years apart. Research in educational psychology often shows that reading aloud improves not only pronunciation but also comprehension, memory, and speaking confidence because the brain processes language through multiple pathways at once. Listening, speaking, and seeing the words together creates stronger learning. Looking around the quiet library, I suddenly understood why my own evening reading sessions had slowly transformed my confidence. They were never just language practice. They were daily reminders that growth happens sentence by sentence, not all at once. My husband admitted that returning to this town wasn't only about accepting a new position. Part of him had wanted to quietly thank the community that had helped him rebuild his confidence long before we met. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to think I chose this move for selfish reasons, he said. I squeezed his hand and smiled. Maybe understanding where you became yourself helps me understand why I fell in love with you. We spent another hour walking through the neighborhood where he had once rented a tiny apartment. Some buildings had changed. New cafes had opened. Old stores had disappeared. Yet certain places remained exactly as he remembered. It reminded both of us that while cities evolve, meaningful memories somehow find ways to stay alive. On our drive home, we talked more openly than we had in years. We spoke about dreams we had quietly postponed, places we still hoped to visit across America, and the kind of childhood we wanted our children to remember. For the first time since moving, I realized we hadn't left our old life behind. We had simply made room for a bigger one. But just as I thought every hidden truth had finally been shared, my husband's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the message, and all the warmth disappeared from his face. Without saying a word, he handed me the screen. The message contained only one short sentence: "The house is available now, but you need to decide today." I looked at him in disbelief because I had no idea what house the message was talking about, or why choosing it before sunset might become the biggest decision our family had faced since moving across America. The house we never planned to buy. Have you ever been given only a few hours to make a decision that could shape the next 10 years of your life? I stared at the message on my husband's phone, wondering how one ordinary sentence could carry so much weight. We had already moved across America, survived uncertainty, and finally started feeling at home. Why would another house suddenly matter? I thought our biggest adventure was behind us. I couldn't have been more wrong. Because what we found behind that front door would force our entire family to ask a question far bigger than where we wanted to live. My husband took a slow breath before explaining. The message came from a local real estate agent he had spoken with weeks earlier. Before our move, he had casually asked to be notified if a particular house ever became available. He never expected it to happen so quickly. "Why this house?" I asked. He smiled, almost embarrassed. Because every time I drove past it years ago, I imagined raising a family there someday. I forgot about that dream until we came back. I looked at him in silence. Sometimes dreams don't disappear. They simply wait patiently until life catches up with them. We drove across town, following quiet tree-lined streets until we reached a peaceful neighborhood. The house wasn't the biggest on the block. It wasn't the newest either. In fact, if someone had shown me 10 beautiful homes, I probably wouldn't have chosen this one first. But there was something impossible to describe. The afternoon sunlight rested gently across the front porch. Wind moved softly through 2 old oak trees. Children's bicycles stood in neighboring driveways. It didn't feel impressive. It felt welcoming. As soon as we stepped inside, our children scattered through the rooms, imagining where their desks, bookshelves, and favorite toys might go. My daughter immediately claimed a bright corner near a large window for reading. My son discovered a backyard wide enough for soccer practice and shouted with excitement before I could even reach the kitchen. Watching them made me realize that children rarely fall in love with square footage. They fall in love with possibility. I quietly walked from room to room. The house needed fresh paint. A few cabinets looked outdated. The backyard fence leaned slightly to one side. Yet none of those details bothered me. Instead, I found myself imagining birthdays, family dinners, Thanksgiving mornings, Christmas lights, homework around the dining table, and quiet evenings reading English stories aloud with my children before bedtime. I had stopped evaluating the house. I had started imagining our future inside it. Behavioral psychologists often explain something known as emotional visualization. When people vividly picture positive experiences connected to a place, motivation and commitment naturally become stronger. I smiled because I was experiencing exactly that. Every room already held memories that hadn't happened yet. Before leaving, I stood alone on the back porch for a few minutes. Birds moved between nearby trees while distant laughter drifted from a neighborhood park. I quietly practiced one simple English sentence that had become my favorite during our move: home is where hope grows. I repeated it several times, enjoying the calm rhythm of the words. Learning English no longer felt like homework. It had become part of the way I reflected on my own life. Sometimes one meaningful sentence stayed with me longer than an entire grammar lesson ever could. On the drive home, our family talked excitedly about furniture, gardens, bicycles, and neighborhood barbecues. Even my usually cautious husband laughed more freely than I had seen in months. For the first time since moving, our conversations focused less on adjusting and more on belonging. That subtle change meant everything. We arrived home believing the decision would be difficult but manageable. Then the real estate agent called again. Her voice sounded apologetic. "I'm so sorry," she said. "Another family has scheduled a final viewing tonight. If they make an offer before yours, the house will likely be sold by morning." My heart sank. After everything we had experienced, after finally finding a place that somehow already felt like home, we might lose it before we had even decided. I looked at my husband, and without speaking, we both understood the next hour could change the ending of our story forever. Was leaving everything really worth it? If someone stopped me today and asked only one question, was moving across America really worth leaving everything behind? I wouldn't answer immediately. Not because I regret our decision, but because the real answer isn't hidden inside a new house, a better neighborhood, or even a fresh beginning. The answer lives inside hundreds of ordinary moments that almost nobody notices. And one final surprise, arriving just when we thought our story was complete, made me realize that the greatest rewards often come after the longest periods of uncertainty. We sat together in the living room that evening, waiting for the real estate agent to call back. No one talked very much. My daughter quietly read her favorite novel. My son bounced a small basketball in the backyard. My husband stared through the window while pretending to watch the sunset. I made tea simply because I needed something to do with my hands. Waiting can feel much longer than moving. Nearly an hour later, my phone finally rang. My heart raced before I even answered. The agent sounded cheerful this time. The other family loved the house, she admitted, but they decided it wasn't the right fit. If you still want it, it's yours. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. I simply smiled at my husband while tears quietly filled my eyes. He didn't ask what she had said. He already knew from my expression. Our children noticed us smiling and immediately started asking excited questions before we could explain anything. That night our house felt unusually alive. We celebrated with homemade pizza, board games, and far too much ice cream. It wasn't really about buying a home. It was about discovering that patience sometimes protects opportunities that rushing could never create. A few weeks later, after we moved into the new house, life slowly settled into an ordinary rhythm again. Morning coffee on the porch became my favorite ritual. The children rode bicycles with neighborhood friends until sunset. My husband planted flowers along the front walkway, insisting he had absolutely no gardening experience while somehow making everything grow beautifully. Looking back, I realized we hadn't been searching for a perfect house. We had been searching for a place where ordinary days could become unforgettable memories. Every evening, I continued reading short English stories aloud. By now, it had become part of our family routine. Sometimes my daughter joined me. Occasionally my son repeated funny expressions just to make everyone laugh. Even my husband read aloud once or twice each week. Without planning it, our family had turned language practice into quality time together. Educational researchers often explain that consistent daily exposure, even for just 15 or 20 minutes, builds stronger language retention than occasional long study sessions. I smiled every time I remembered that. We weren't trying to become perfect English speakers overnight. We were simply becoming a family that never stopped learning. One afternoon Rachel visited with fresh cookies and laughed as she looked around the house. "You know," she said, "when you first arrived, I wasn't sure you'd stay here very long." I laughed too because she was right. During those first uncertain weeks, I still carried one foot in my old life and one foot in my new one. Now I couldn't imagine living anywhere else. That realization surprised me more than the move itself. Home had quietly stopped being an address. It had become the people who filled every room with kindness, conversation, and laughter. Then, while organizing old moving boxes in the garage, I discovered the very first notebook I had used after arriving here. Inside were simple English sentences I had written during those nervous early days. "I hope this place feels like home. I hope the children will be happy. I hope we made the right decision." Reading those words brought tears to my eyes because every hope on those pages had slowly come true, though never in the way I originally imagined. As I gently closed the notebook, my husband walked into the garage holding another small envelope that had just arrived in the mail. He smiled mysteriously before handing it to me. "I think," he whispered, "this might be the beginning of our next adventure." I looked down at the unfamiliar return address, completely unaware that what waited inside would give our family's story one final, unforgettable ending. Home was never just a place. What if the happiest ending isn't the moment you finally arrive, but the moment you realize you stopped looking back? If you've stayed with me until now, you already know this was never just a story about moving across America. It was a story about choosing growth over comfort, hope over fear, and love over certainty. But the final surprise waiting inside one small envelope reminded me that life has a beautiful habit of rewarding people who keep moving forward, even when they have no idea what comes next. I carefully opened the envelope while my husband and children gathered around the kitchen table. Inside was a handwritten letter from the community library we had visited so many times since moving here. At first, I thought it was simply another newsletter. Instead, the librarian thanked me for volunteering at the weekly reading circle and invited me to become a permanent community reading mentor for beginner English learners. I read the letter twice because I honestly couldn't believe it. Months earlier, I had been nervous about reading one simple paragraph aloud. Now someone believed I could help other people discover confidence through stories. I looked at my husband, and before I said a word, he smiled proudly. "I knew they'd ask you," he said. "You've been inspiring people without even realizing it." His words stayed with me long after the excitement settled. Sometimes the people around us notice our growth long before we do. The following Saturday, I stood in front of a small group of learners at the library, holding the same kind of short English story that had quietly changed my own life. My hands were slightly nervous, but my heart felt calm. I welcomed everyone with a smile and spoke slowly, exactly the way I had practiced every evening at home. I reminded them that perfect pronunciation wasn't our goal. Communication was. Confidence was. Enjoying the journey was. Research in language education consistently shows that learners improve more effectively when they feel emotionally safe, encouraged, and connected to meaningful stories instead of fearing every small mistake. Looking around the room, I could see those ideas becoming real. People smiled more. They volunteered to read aloud. They laughed at small pronunciation slips instead of feeling embarrassed. Learning became lighter because nobody expected perfection. Back at home, our family continued creating simple traditions that made every season feel special. Spring meant planting flowers together. Summer meant neighborhood picnics and evening walks. Autumn brought colorful leaves, pumpkin festivals, and longer reading nights by the fireplace. Winter filled the house with warm soup, holiday music, and quiet conversations after the children had fallen asleep. Those ordinary moments slowly became the greatest treasures we owned. Looking back now, I finally know how to answer the question that began this entire journey. Was it worth leaving everything behind? Yes, but not because we found a better house, a different town, or new opportunities. It was worth it because we discovered better versions of ourselves. We learned that courage often begins with one difficult conversation. Love grows stronger through small daily choices. Children teach adults how to embrace change. Home is built through kindness, not bricks. And learning English, one simple story at a time, can become far more than language practice. It can become a bridge connecting people, memories, and dreams. Every evening, I still read aloud for a few minutes. Sometimes my children join me. Sometimes my husband listens while making tea. Sometimes I simply sit by the window, hearing my own voice become steadier than it was yesterday. That is how growth usually happens. quietly, patiently, one sentence at a time. If my story has taught me anything, it is this: you don't need to change countries, become someone else, or wait for the perfect moment to begin a new chapter. Sometimes all you need is the courage to turn one more page. And perhaps, somewhere in the story you're living today, your happiest chapter has already begun without you noticing. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. I truly hope these simple English stories have helped your listening, reading, speaking, and confidence grow a little stronger every day. Maybe one day our paths will cross in another story, another town, or another quiet moment where life once again asks a simple question with an extraordinary answer.